I'm Ben Weingarten,
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, first, happy Thanksgiving to all, and we have a veritable feast of topics to cover on this Thanksgiving Eve. Will is going to kick us off by talking about I believe, Clinton judge who has dismissed the Comey and Tish James indictments, at least for now. Inez is going to talk a little bit about the Democrats' call on the intelligence and military community to resist, a running theme on this podcast. Amber is going to talk a little bit about the Trump-Mamdani powwow in the Oval Office. And I'll take us home by talking a little bit about the Trump administration's Muslim Brotherhood terrorist designation executive order, one that is arguably a couple of decades in the making. But with that, let's start off with Will.
Yeah, so I believe it was either yesterday or the day before. No. It was Monday. I remember all this breaking. The what happened was Judge Curry in South Carolina, who was appointed by designation, decided to dismiss both of the indictments against James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James on the grounds that an interim U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Lindsay Halligan, was not properly appointed. So both of those indictments are now in question. I've done a number of hits on this subject over the last few days. It was really interesting to sort of read the opinion, and it's yet another example of a district judge kind of not getting where the Supreme Court's jurisprudence has gone in the past few years, and not understanding that the unitary executive is not a theory, it's the structure of our Constitution. And as a result, you can't, approve of statutes or statutes that you can't interpret statutes in a way that strips authority from the executive and grants them to the branch. And so that's kind of what happens here. So to kind of explain a little bit of what the scheme is here and why Halligan is argued not to have been properly appointed. U.S. attorneys for any given districts are pretty commonly understood to be inferior officers. So principal officers, people like the Secretary of State, heads of cabinet departments, the Attorney General, have to be approved by appointment by the president or nomination by the Senate and then confirmation by the Senate. Inferior officers don't have to be approved that way. They can be approved that way in the normal sort of nomination by the president and confirmation by the Senate, but they can also be approved by methods approved by statute. And one of those statutory methods is the statute 28 USC 546. It might be 18. I need to remember. Always hard to forget everything off the top of my head. But that statute provides that the Attorney General is allowed to appoint interim U.S. attorneys whenever there is a vacancy for a 120-day term. And the question then is what happens when that 120-day term expires? The government's reading says that authority doesn't go away. The statute is clear by its terms. The only exception to the authority of the Attorney General is that they're not allowed to appoint someone who has been rejected by the Senate. But the theory propounded by Comey and agreed to by the judge says that after that 120 days, the authority leaves the Attorney General and goes to the district court to appoint an interim U.S. attorney, and only that person can only be replaced by a Senate confirmed U.S. attorney. Now, the problem with that theory, it's wrong in the plain language of the statute, in my view, which actually is pretty expansive in terms of the grant of authority to the Attorney General, and it, by its own terms, highlights the only exception to that authority. But secondly, I think the bigger problem is that it just runs straight into the separation of powers, because while Congress can set terms by which the Attorney General can appoint people, what it can't do is it can't create essentially a situation where Article 3 judges or Article 1 members of Congress can appoint and have the exclusive authority to appoint members of the executive branch wielding prosecutorial authority. That cannot work. That's what ultimately, that's the heart of the dissent of Justice Scalia and Morrison and Olson, that it's probably the most powerful dissent in the world because it's now seen as the correct opinion. The reason why the independent counsel statute can't survive is because you can't grant Congress the right to prosecute people. The right to prosecute people belongs to the executive branch. Same thing here. You can't grant district judges the exclusive right, rather, to prosecute people and to appoint people that serve under the president. That doesn't work in our separation of power scheme. So, if this statute were ambiguous, there's something called constitutional avoidance, the canon of constitutional avoidance that counsels judges to interpret statutes in such a way not to raise major constitutional questions on the theory that Congress isn't trying to violate the Constitution with how it writes statutes. This judge and Comey and everybody else just ran squarely into that and ignored it. So it's just yet another example of district judges trying to find ways to avoid giving the administration what it wants, trying to find ways to avoid the righteous prosecution of people who've done real harm. And I think it will be reversed, and I certainly hope it will be reversed.
So I'll be really brief in response and appreciate the legal analysis here on the merits. And in some ways, it's like you almost have to set aside the merits because the judge sort of gives away the game in the first sentence of the orders dismissing these indictments when she impugns the qualifications of Halligan. And of course, let's not forget that Halligan was parachuted in essentially because you had insubordination within the ranks of the Justice Department, it appears, being unwilling to bring these cases, even though they appear to both be very strong cases on the merits. In the Tish James case, I mean, she just appears to be totally dead to rights on the merits and the substance. So I think, ultimately at the end of the day, you have the mischief here of a clearly political judge. She appears to be wrong in terms of the legitimacy of the Halligan appointment. And then I think there's also a big dispute about whether or not the judge can just dismiss the indictments. It's like this notion that it's all fruit of a poisonous tree, despite the fact that you had the Justice Department signing off on these indictments. So at the end of the day, the one saving grace here maybe is that, first of all, maybe we will get a firmer ruling, an overturn on appeal, which does substantiate the rights of the executive branch here. And I think we're going to have lots of fights probably going forward about interim appointments and such. This has been building up, it seems like, over a long time. It also applies with U.S. attorneys elsewhere as well. And then the whole without prejudice argument of the indictments obviously suggests that both of them can be brought again. And so the question will be, can you get a fair hearing essentially in these venues in terms of both jury and judge? And I think that remains to be seen, but hopefully justice is allowed to be fully pursued here and justice ultimately is done in the instances of both of these individuals.
Yeah, I think this is another example of, judges trying to find any colorable argument, as Will said, to basically avoid giving the Trump administration what they want. And this is going to keep coming up again and again, even outside of the context of separation of powers. And because there's these two major threads that have been running through all of these cases. One of them is the power of the executive branch to actually choose who works for the president, the power of the president to choose who works for the executive branch, rather. The other long line is basically that our courts aren't set up so that every single time, the lower courts are supposed to try with good faith to try to follow the instructions of the courts above them and the appeals, and then ultimately the Supreme Court. And there's no practical way for the Supreme Court to weigh in on every single colorable argument that any minor judge can pull out of his rear end to try to prevent the Trump administration from doing something that's clearly lawful. And I mean, we've discussed these two threads over and over and over again. I think they're going to keep coming up, honestly, and they're gonna end in some way. Either we're going to restructure the courts. Hopefully, the Supreme Court will be very detailed and expansive and firm on what the powers of Article 2 actually are, what the powers of the executive actually are with regard to the people who work under him and are there only to carry out his policy. Remember, the president is the only one who has any legitimacy from the American people. None of these other people are standing in front of, most of them are not even, Senate confirmed. Most of them are not standing in front of the American people in any way. They're completely unaccountable, and their accountability and their small d democratic accountability and legitimacy runs only through the president. this is just going to keep coming up in a bunch of different forums, and I'm glad Will did the deep dive on the specific colorable argument from the specific judge, because I did not. But the overall pattern is very clear.
Yeah, I will underscore again that the merits of the cases are in no way challenged by this judge's ruling. So the celebration of James Comey releasing another, full face selfie, very boomer-esque, celebrating and claiming that he's been vindicated is very premature. And it's also just really frustrating to see the hypocrisy of these people claiming that this is political weaponization. Of course, Letitia James literally ran on the idea of prosecuting Trump. James Comey advancing the Russiagate hoax in order to go after Donald Trump. And so it's not political weaponization to hold people accountable for political weaponization.
And with that, let's turn it over to Inez to talk about some more weaponization, this time in Congress, and this attempt to create dissent within the ranks in the armed forces and in our intelligence community.
Yeah, that last bit, I think, is not getting the focus that the military piece of it is, the intelligence community. But so this video dropped shortly after. I was kind of mad that we missed it in our last episode. Now it seems like kind of 6 days old news, and the way our news cycle works these days, that seems old news. But I think it's extremely important to highlight there are 6 Democrats from Senate and Congress that formerly served in the military, especially one currently he's retired, right? So Senator Mark Kelly is, and this matters for the topic we're going to go forward on, but he's still a military retiree. He's getting a pension, which makes him still subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, unlike the other people in this video. But it's that typical Dem format video where usually they used to do it with celebrities, where they each say part of a sentence and then they flip between the 6 people and they complete a sentence together. But in this case, the sentence was essentially urging, in a sort of coy way, that acknowledged that our U.S. military members are not obliged to follow unlawful orders, unconstitutional orders, but in a kind of coy way, saying that this is the time for the military to think about defying the president's orders, defying the president's policies, because they're hinting at that those policies are unlawful and unconstitutional, that all the usual stuff, that Donald Trump's an authoritarian and a fascist, and he's, his orders are somehow not lawful. I think the language of this video is probably careful enough that Donald Trump, of course, called them seditious. I think the intent of this video is seditious, but what they were literally repeating, the language they were literally repeating, is that you don't have to follow unlawful orders. Now, the entire ball game is, what is an unlawful order? And this is both the honor and the weight of being a member of the U.S. military, is that there are cliffs on both sides. The military, of course, depends on immediate and inarguable chain of command. That's something that is necessary to command, even on the before we get to the Pentagon, on the battlefield. You may, as a commander, have the heavy burden of making a decision that might kill some of your men, and you have to be able to order them against their basic human instinct into battle. And so that chain of command is extremely important, and you can't have every soldier sort of coming up with a political theory as to why all the time this order or that order might be unlawful. At the same time, the U.S. military is not supposed to follow unlawful and unconstitutional orders. They are subject to the Constitution. So there's these very heavy weight on both sides. But this video is a clear and obvious attempt, to me, even if the language is weaselly, to encourage what is essentially, traitorous behavior in the U.S. military, and then in the intelligence community, which doesn't need the encouragement to abuse their powers. So I do think this is extremely serious and on the order of, it reminded me a lot of something we repeat on this show quite frequently, which is the calling around of U.S. generals under the first Trump administration to people or geopolitical rivals like China, saying, no, don't react to what this crazy president does. I'll let you know. That is the most fundamental norm, is that the civilian control, which is represented in the person of the president, over the military, that there is no independent military politicking in America. And so, frankly, for the other five, they're not under this code. Hegseth has potentially looked at well, I mean, theoretically, he could be restored to active duty, Mark Kelly, and court-martialed for this. I think that would probably be a mistake. We've necessarily kept the enforcement of that code somewhat lax, because otherwise we couldn't have military retirees in Congress, right? Like, it's a little bit absurd to say that the guy can't express, for example, political opinions. He's a U.S. senator. So I think it'd be very difficult, especially since the language in this video uses the word lawful and unlawful in a way that I think is coy, but I don't think that the prosecution would go anywhere. Something more more realistic, I think they could bust him down and change his pension. I think that Hegseth might be able to he has the power to do that, and I think he might be actually able to pull that one off. But after all of this is like a long-running theme. We're on long-running themes this Thanksgiving weekend. After all of the endless talk about January 6th and sedition, when it was a bunch of people in zip ties in the Capitol in a riot, like, not a good thing, but there was no chance that the U.S. government was ever going to be overturned, right? Now we have sitting senators and congressmen encouraging basically rebellion and sedition among the military and the intelligence officers, who again take their legitimacy ultimately from the elected president. And that's the most basic norm of, quote unquote, our democracy, which is once again being absolutely flouted in for total political purpose by Democrats. And that has consequences. It has consequences. With that, I'll turn it over to the group.
The Democrats are hiding behind the lack of specificity in their video as evidence that they were merely instructing troops to do what they're already trained to do. But I actually think it's that lack of specificity that makes it so obvious that they were trying to sow confusion and foment rebellion from the military against Trump, because none of them could name an illegal order that Trump had given them. If they had said, if Trump tells you to shoot a civilian in the head, then you obviously have a duty and a responsibility to ignore that order, right? Which is what troops are already trained to do when they enter the military. But they didn't. They intentionally left it vague because they wanted the military to question every single order that comes down the chain of command from the commander-in-chief, to sow this sort of chaos and disorder within the military. And I interviewed Congressman Jack Bergman about this recently. He's from Michigan. He's the highest ranking member of the military ever elected to Congress, 3-star Marine Corps general, lieutenant general. And he called it dangerous. He was like, I'm so disappointed in my colleagues, including Alyssa Slotkin, who's also from Michigan, because they should know better. They were clearly using a read between the lines kind of language in order to convince military members, particularly low-ranking military members, to exit the chain of command and try to stop Trump from executing a lawful agenda. So the investigation of Mark Kelly, to me, is completely legitimate. I don't know if it'll actually go anywhere, but this video was far more damaging than any of the Democrats and their defenders were trying to lead the American public to believe.
Can I add something to what Amber said? It's so weaselly and cowardly on the part of these Democrats. The troops already know that they have this very high burden and responsibility. They already know they can't follow unlawful orders. But as Amber notes, they didn't specify any specific, so they themselves avoided the difficult question. They're just encouraging, 22-year-olds to think about and perhaps act on. So there's a very weaselly and cowardly aspect to this.
They refuse to. Sorry, Will, you want to go ahead?
No, you go for it.
I was just going to say they refuse to, pointedly, they refuse to identify what orders are lawless, and then they refuse to identify who has been carrying out lawless orders. I think Senator Slotkin might be the only one who ever addressed anything remotely resembling what they're talking about here. in their sort of just asking questions way, which is the strikes on narco terrorists in our own hemisphere. And she basically is just raising questions about them, but won't call it out. So it is too cute by half. There is cowardice. It is intentionally vague, probably to avoid potentially violating laws or the code of justice. But at the end of the day, I think, one thing to point out is that the left has always wanted to break the military as an institution. They wanted to wokeify it, they wanted to politicize it. And then, of course, breaking down the chain of command means utter chaos ultimately, and the inability of the military to function, and really our government at the end of the day and our republic to function. So I think that is worth pointing out. Also, I'm glad, Inez, that you brought up the fact that this is a long-running theme here where you have the rogue generals, essentially, sometimes ex-generals, who say ridiculously unhinged things politically and themselves are trying to foment seemingly chaos and undermine and subvert and sabotage the executive branch. And here you have essentially Senator Kelly trading on his rank. We obviously know that you've had people, ex-deep state members, who trade on their background plus security clearances when they spread clear disinformation and propaganda as a means of targeting the administration, of course, during Trump 1, most significantly. So this is a major problem. And I guess the question is, how do you deter the behavior? And maybe it is the threat and court-martialing. We know that there's some kind of FBI probe here. Let's see what the substance of that probe and the predication of it ultimately is. And then I think the last question to ask is, this has been a long-running resistance theme here about the military defying the president, essentially. And so why now and why in this way? I don't think that it was just random. This is probably part of a broader scheme, and we'll have to ultimately see how it plays out to determine whether or not this was just a random occasion or whether this is pointed towards something, and maybe that means related to an impeachment, perhaps, to the extent you have a Democrat-controlled or partially controlled Congress after the midterms.
Yeah, I think it's really just obnoxious. Everybody's hit upon the basic smarminess of what they were saying and how they were playing dumb and naive, like, oh, we didn't specify what orders. It's like, actually, that makes it worse. You're undermining good order and discipline. So I think that Pete Hegseth going after Mark Kelly is totally called for. It's ridiculous. Mark Kelly should know better. He was a captain in the U.S. Navy. He knows that he shouldn't be randomly instilling doubt in, junior sailors that their orders are unlawful without some evidence or some specifics about that, because they have a first obligation to follow their superiors' orders. And if they don't do so, they could be court-martialed for it. So, talk about something that could undermine good order and discipline, which he's under an obligation not to do. He's still bound by the US UCMJ because he takes a military pension. And he knows that. Really ridiculous conduct from him.
So with that, let's go to Amber to talk about something completely different, the Zoran Mamdani meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office.
Yes, they met on Friday, and it was a very friendly meeting. When they went to speak with the press afterwards, the boys were all smiles. Trump cracked a few jokes, saved Mamdani from the press a few times. The perhaps most high-profile moment was when Mamdani was asked if he still views Trump as a fascist, and he started to give this sort of mealy-mouthed answer. And Trump said, just say yes. It's easier if you just say yes, and had a good laugh about it. He said, I don't mind. They said that they actually agree on more than they thought, and Trump thinks that Mamdani is going to do a good job leading New York. It was sort of a classic Trump the politician moment, Trump the negotiator moment, where he really is able to get along with a lot of people, even ones who he has previously had pretty tough relationships, tense relationships with. But of course, Trump's insistence that everything's going to be fine with Mamdani at the helm were pretty quickly dashed, those hopes, because Mamdani appointed to his transition team earlier this week the author of a book called The End of Policing, who is a sort of known defund the police fan and was cited by a lot of the members of the Defund the Police movement back in 2020. The guy's name is Alex Vitale. He's also a sociology professor at Brooklyn College. He's called police the natural enemy of the working class. He has said that the police are class enemies and they don't fit into the class struggle. The problem is not police training, police diversity, or police methods. The problem is policing itself. So it's kind of unclear what exactly Mamdani and Trump agreed upon in the meeting and whether or not Mamdani is going to allow Trump to do anything in New York City. Perhaps there is still the looming threat of defunding if he does not cooperate with ICE or does not allow the police to do their jobs. Mamdani, notably in an interview following the meeting with Trump on CBS Sunday mornings, when asked whether or not Trump was still planning on sending in the National Guard or if he had backed down on that threat, Mamdani would not answer the question, repeatedly sort of punted, which tells me that Trump still intends or at least wants to have the looming threat of sending in the National Guard. But I'm curious about what you all think. What was the true purpose of this meeting, and what do you think they actually talked about behind closed doors that led Trump to presenting, at least publicly, as some kind of friend to Mamdani?
Yeah, as the resident Mamdani hater, I just feel like I've been writing and talking about nothing else for the last several months. I'm frankly just I don't understand how people still don't get this about Trump. If Trump can talk to Kim Jong-un, okay, he can talk to Mamdani. Like this is his way. He says nice things about people what he's negotiating with while they're, across the table. And this doesn't mean anything about what federal policy and posture will be like towards New York City under Mamdani. It means absolutely nothing. And in fact, I would be shocked if Trump is not exploring every option to try to hem in some of the things that Mamdani wants to do, including on the policing front. And there is a lot that feds can do, right? Starting with sending in ICE and stepping up raids of illegal migrants in New York City. He can also surge federal prosecutors to the New York City area and start aggressively prosecuting federal crime that happens, right? So if somebody stabs somebody on the subway, that's presumably is a state crime. But if, for example, they stop somebody over a drug deal that crossed into New Jersey at any point, there is a federal nexus for that crime, and there's plenty of federal drug laws and a substantial portion of the crime that would normally be prosecuted by the state. Obviously it's not the majority and it's not most of it, but it could help. Like the feds could help prosecute federal crimes and just have surge more resources to that area to try to offset some of the things Mamdani wants to do in that regard. And then finally, Amber mentioned the funds. New York City gets a lot of federal money, and that gives Trump a lot of control over New York City. So, and we know that Trump cares about the city. That it's where he's from. He's from Queens, right? So, it's the place where he made his fortune. We know that he cares about the future of New York City in a more personal way. And anyway, I think the freaking out on the right about this has been a little bit ridiculous. Like, I don't think anyone is less enthusiastic about saying Mamdani as mayor, but the idea that Trump shouldn't meet with the mayor of New York City, or that, like, I don't know. I remember disliking this about Trump in 2015, and then, by 2017, I realized that he does this to everybody, and it makes you look silly when you freak out when he says nice things about somebody he's in negotiation with, whether it's, Putin, or whether it's, Kim Jong-un, or whoever else that he's sitting down with, or the Muslim socialist mayor who wants to defund the police in New York City. This is his way. He's got a lot of success with his way, and just continually freaking out about Trump saying nice things about someone he's currently in negotiations with is, in my view, it's getting silly. Calm down. This doesn't mean anything about the posture of the Trump administration towards the policies that Mamdani is likely to enact in New York City.
I agree. It's unsurprising that he would treat Zoran Mamdani the same way he treats Kim Jong-un or Xi or Vladimir Putin or anyone else around the world. Probably the way he would talk to Maduro if they had a conversation too. I also think that Trump does on a personal level and a professional level. He cares about New York a lot. So this is an issue that's near and dear to him. And he obviously wants to be able to push New York in a direction that he views as favorable. Plus, to a large extent, he and the federal government do control the power of the purse here. So they have all the leverage. A lot of people, in the chattering class were talking about how you saw the phrase game recognized game over and over again. Like he respects the political shrewdness and acumen of Mamdani. I don't know that that explains why it seemed to be such a cordial visit that they had. Also, I do think there is something to the notion that Trump is really leaned into populism during that conversation. I think that that was probably very intentional and a conscious move, even though Mamdani represents the communist version of populism. And I could also be convinced that this was about a bear hug. It was sort of a power play, killing Mamdani with kindness, and also the notion that it might stir dissension within Mamdani's own base. He had to kind of sit there and grin and smile and agree. And that probably is really toxic to a lot of his supporters. All that said, I still think it was incredibly painful to watch. Like, I would not have it in me to sit in there, even if what we're saying and what we agree at the end of the day is that this is about having political power over Mamdani, and this is a dance. It's a negotiation, and you get more bees with honey. And then other times you can have an open hand and sometimes a closed fist. And we can very easily see Trump turn on Mamdani any day over any particular issue.
Operation
But
Midnight Hammer over New York City.
exactly. But that said, it's still incredibly hard to do that. I don't think I would have that in me. I don't know if any of you would have it in you. You understand kind of all is fair in love and politics, but that said, nevertheless, pretty difficult to grin and bear that, in my view.
Yeah, my favorite hotline from all of that was that fascist line where he's somebody, I think it was Jackie Heinrich or something, asking him if Mamdani, if he still thinks Trump is a fascist, and Mamdani's mumbling around, and Trump's like, you can just say yes, to that, it's fine. Totally takes the sting out of the word fascism and the accusation of fascism that's so facile. And somebody pointed out that, like, Mamdani can't really explain himself. Like, imagine somebody in Germany, some liberal in Germany during Hitler's reign being like, well, I felt like I had to work with Hitler in order to accomplish, affordability for people in my local region. Everybody looked at you like you're insane. Like, no, if you call somebody a fascist, they're beyond the pale of political cooperation. And yet what Trump managed to do is reveal that that's all facile and silly.
So with that, I guess in a semi-related topic, I will talk a bit about the Trump administration's executive order to start the process of working towards designating several branches or subdivisions of the Muslim Brotherhood, specifically in a few countries within the Middle East, including among them Lebanon and others. This is an executive order and a process that has been a long time coming and a long time building. It was threatened during Trump 1, but not executed upon. And here we are in year 1 of Trump 2, and finally coming to fruition. The Muslim Brotherhood, as the order lays out, is the tip of the spear and the progenitor of all of Sunni jihadism, as well as Sunni Islamic supremacist groups and movements that are nonviolent in their nature, which is in some ways even more insidious, subverting, sabotaging, and penetrating from within toward the end of ultimately Islamic domination over the world. But all you need to know about the Brotherhood is that Hamas was and is the Palestinian branch of the Brotherhood. To know its nature, you can link the Brotherhood to Al Qaeda, you can link it to a slew of other jihadist groups as well. And then again, sort of front groups that operate in the West to very damaging and detrimental effect. So going ahead and starting this process of designation is a substantial move. First of all, it demonstrates a recognition of the size, scope, and nature of the threat, and a willingness to leverage the tools of the executive branch to actually go about neutralizing it. This comes on the heels of Texas also designating not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but also CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which, if you look at its origins, was started essentially to serve as a propaganda arm and mouthpiece for Hamas in the West, was an unindicted co-conspirator in the then largest terrorism financing case in American history, the Holy Land Foundation case. And the evidence there established that CARE and other groups were part of a long-term plan for the Muslim Brotherhood to build its roots within the West and ultimately to cause us to sabotage ourselves, to use our freedoms against us, to exploit our freedoms, to ultimately achieve the ends of domination and conquering by Islam here and across the world. And that strategy has worked pretty well to date. It's illustrated in the fact that it took multiple decades, even after the Holy Land Foundation case, to get to terrorism designation here. There's been recurring legislation in Congress in both the House and Senate, which is arguably broader and even more robust in its focus than this executive order. So the question ultimately is, this on its merits is a great thing that we're finally moving towards designating branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, as many Muslim countries themselves have done, including our allies and partners. The question ultimately is going to be, I think, how vigorous is the enforcement? Does it target all branches and subdivisions that go beyond the few countries that are named within the executive order? And will it ultimately, if vigorously enforced, reach the domestic front groups within America and beyond across the West? So I think those are pivotal and vital questions about this. But nevertheless, it's a recognition of the nature of this threat, how it manifests itself, and the imperative to use every tool to neutralize and combat it. So with that, I turn it over to the group. What do you make of this designation, and where do you see the administration ultimately landing in the way of the vigorousness and how broad its enforcement will ultimately be?
Well, to connect it to the previous topic, as Ben said, I think this is somewhat of the undercovered piece of the Mamdani election, and we've talked about here, and a lot of people have talked about, like, obviously the most visible supporters of Mamdani were the downwardly mobile professionals, right? What I referred to as the master's class, and these are mostly, white/rainbow progressives, the people who are queers for Palestine, these types of people. There was a second half of his base that really is at least in part responsible for his election. And Linda Sarsour, the former organizer of the Women's March, who was booted from that for anti-Semitism, but so she was she had some very candid remarks at an Islamic forum, or working with CARE, basically suggesting that CARE was one of the major funders and players behind Mamdani's rise. Mamdani very explicitly in the campaign repeatedly aligned himself with what is forming as I think the biggest organized political bloc of Islamic voters in the United States, in New York. And the evidence I have for that, and this is not me saying that Mamdani is an Islamist. Like I've said many times, I don't think he is. I think he uses his identity as a Muslim brown person, as just two little coins on the oppression identity matrix. It's really a way of saying I'm not white more than anything else. I'm not white. I'm oppressed. I don't think he's serious about his faith and the numerous programs that he promised to implement with regard to sex change operations and LGBT stuff is obviously completely anathema to real Islam. That being said, he courted Muslim voters as a part of this ethnic voting bloc. And New York City has a long history of that kind of ethnic politics, ethnic retail politics. What is it going to mean when the next Democrat, and I think it's pretty clear the next Democrat who runs for mayor in New York City is going to have to do the same, go mosque to mosque in the same way and get endorsements in the same way as they do, for example, in the Black church community, right? If you're a Democrat running, almost anywhere, and especially in like big cities with a large Black population, you know that you need to show up to certain pastors and you need to essentially negotiate political favors for their block in exchange for their endorsement because they drive voters to the polls, right? That, you can like that kind of ethnic retail politics, you can hate it. It's definitely part of most large cities in America, and New York in particular, for more than for 150 years. It's been part of the politics of New York. The question is, what is it going to look like when that kind of politics includes people who are, unlike Mamdani, very serious about their Muslim faith, who hold views that are completely anathema to Western values, and who will be negotiating settlements from future Democratic candidates and favors and carve-outs and eventually, substantive policy change. And Mamdani does represent that. So I don't know the answer to Ben's open question of how harshly this is going to be enforced in the United States, but that is actually the biggest question to me, not outside of the United States, because it's pretty clear to me that we've expanded massively our Muslim immigration since 9/11. In the last about 25 years, we now have, I think it's 1.5% of America is Muslim overall, but in New York City, it's, as we found out in this election, it's 9%. And that voting bloc may behave very, very differently at 9%, where they can negotiate favors, than at 1%. And, looking over at London and Europe and European cities on the continent, that does not make me copacetic about our future in that regard. So Ben's question is really well taken. I know I haven't really provided an answer, but I hope I've provided some urgency to the question. I think this is going to be an increasing part of our politics, particularly in those cities where we have had concentrated Muslim migration.
Yeah, I'm happy to see this. On terms of the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist designation, a little concerned that obviously Qatar isn't included because Qatar just gets away with murder on all this stuff. At the same time, I understand the realpolitik of it in the sense that Qatar made a deal and was the driving force in, getting back the hostages in the last hostage deal. They're the ones who bullied Hamas into it. So, and Trump has clearly made a kind of deal with to give them grace in a lot of different respects. I mean, we have that we basically gave them a security guarantee, a massive one, as part of the peace deal in Gaza. So, you can't get everything you want, but yeah, I mean, we shouldn't be tolerating the Muslim Brotherhood. We shouldn't be tolerating CARE and going after them. I mean, they're at a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated front. There's been way too much indulgence of this sort of pro-terrorist nonsense coming from the Islamists in this country, and we should put a stop to it. You don't get to support foreign terrorist organizations here. Sorry, that's the way it works.
Yeah, I don't have much to add about the Muslim Brotherhood. I think you all covered it, but I wanted to throw in this other story regarding the Islamization of America, which is this, massive story involving the fraud of the Somalians in Minnesota, where they were basically grifting off of the state and federal Medicare programs, taking those taxpayer dollars and in some cases sending millions to Al-Shabaab. Trump has actually stripped them of their temporary protected status, which is a fantastic move and long overdue. You, of course, have Ilhan Omar in Congress basically declaring her loyalty to Somalia over the United States and her constituents, stealing from American taxpayers to fund luxury lifestyles, but also literal terrorism. And it's beyond disturbing. If you haven't read it already, the City Journal report from Chris Rufo is very eye-opening.
Yeah, I would second that as well. And just as a point of fact, the countries that are referenced in the order are Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. There's been some analysis suggesting that Turkey and Qatar were omitted in part because they don't have formally organized branches or subdivisions there. But obviously, these have been patrons of MB-linked groups, if nothing else. So, we will see ultimately how the administration threads the needle between working with these countries and these countries' ties to obviously malign actors that we're targeting. With that, let's turn it over.
Makes sense. Realpolitik may make sense about Turkey and Qatar. That's foreign based. That's why I would be so much more concerned, honestly. Like, if we were to have this strictly enforced outside versus inside, I'm much more concerned about the organizations here. Anyway, my 2 cents.
Yeah, and to that end, let's see what happens with Texas, because obviously there's going to be litigation, and I think Texas's governor, I think Governor Abbott has said, "Bring it on, let's go into discovery." So things will get very spicy there, I suspect, very quickly. With that, let's turn it over to parting shots with whoever wants to kick us off.
Yeah, I'll go first. Final thought is that the big sham case in Georgia was finally dismissed today. Remember, Fannie Willis brought this case but was disqualified because she decided to give a job to her boyfriend and lie about it on the case. And as a result, there wasn't another prosecutor's office in the state that was willing to take it on. So the guy who's the head of the prosecutors committee took it on and basically said none of these prosecutions should go forwards. He was actually particularly good. He gave a very lengthy opinion where he said that some of these prosecutions were completely groundless in the first instance, especially the one against Jeff Clark, which is something I've said for a long time. The lawfare against Clark has been maybe the worst and most disgusting part of the entire fiasco. But it's a really good day for everybody who was prosecuted in Georgia. I'm really happy for them, who feel like a pretty big weight has been lifted off their shoulders. The next move is obviously there's still this lingering prosecution in Arizona that needs to be dealt with. And I think it's time to really put pressure on Chris Mays to drop that as one as well. This stuff is all frivolous and needs to go.
I'll go ahead and give us a readout of the potential Ukraine-Russia peace deal. It's supposedly a 28-point plan. I think the reason why we didn't do a full segment on it is because the real specifics of the deal are not public yet. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is still supposed to travel to the US before the end of this month to really hammer out the final details and actually see if this thing gets across the finish line. But really, the key points that have been publicly reported are that Ukraine is going to have to give up some of the territory that they lost to Russia during the war, but they will also get security guarantees, which were obviously a sticking point for that meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance earlier this year at the beginning of the presidency. Ukraine also has to commit not to join NATO. There were some weird things going on with whether or not this deal was actually authored by the US or authored by Russia. Members of Congress claiming that Secretary of State Marco Rubio told them that it was authored by Russia. The administration has publicly denied that. So there's some weird accusations flying around. There was the leaking of a call that Steve Witkoff had with the Russians. So still remains to be seen whether or not this thing will actually be finalized and if Ukraine and Russia will agree to it. But in general, looks like some really great progress being made to potentially wrap up this conflict.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. I mean, it's so Marco Rubio said that the talks in Europe that do involve Ukraine have been the most productive so far. So this thing that was leaked is not the final plan. There's a lot to criticize in those 28 points, but even more, it's sort of the intrigue as to where it came from and how it got out is just a dizzying tale in itself. And perhaps we'll get more into this topic if hopefully there is progress made in the next pod next week. But yeah, I mean, I've been trying to keep track of this story, and frankly, finding myself chasing my own tail a lot as to what the actual outlines of this kind of deal are. So for now, I'll hold off and say I don't. I'll wait till there's actually a deal presented before critiquing or cheering it. In terms of, I was going to bring up Chris Rubo's piece for my final thoughts, but Amber already beat me to that, or Ben beat me to it. I can't remember. So I'll close on something fun for Thanksgiving and say that Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy has set off a discourse online about how people dress when they travel, when they fly. He's gotten a lot of pushback for saying people should wear sweatpants and pajamas on the airplane. I think he's 100% correct. People push back. They say that we are treated like cattle by the TSA and by the airlines, and so we have a right to be comfortable. That is all true, but objectively, you are degrading yourself when you walk out of the house in pajamas and go and you're degrading your fellow passengers. Even the TSA agent probably would like to dress like that and can't just because of the uniform. So you're not really making their day worse. You're making your own day worse and everyone around you who is subjected to similar cattle-like conditions worse. So yes, you can count me as team anti-sweatpants and pajamas in public.
I so agree. And I wanted to add one more quick thing about the Ukraine deal, because I think this is important. One of the original tenets of this 28-point plan apparently wanted an audit of all of the US money that and weaponry that was given to Ukraine. And that was changed to reflect that Ukraine will essentially get full amnesty for any actions taken during the war. So if you were wondering if we could eventually trace all of the money we gave them, the answer is probably not.
So I'll close us out also on Thanksgiving. I was curious and looked back at George Washington's Thanksgiving proclamation in 1789. And, obviously, Thanksgiving has now been completely commercialized, and, we all enjoy kind of all of the material benefits that we get, the bounty that we have to live in this country. But when you go back and you look at the original Thanksgiving proclamation, it's really about praying to God and thanking God for essentially giving us the free will and endowing us with the rights that ultimately allowed us to establish a country and a government that would allow us to fulfill our own potential, and obviously to worship as we saw fit. And that this ultimately culminated in or resulted in all manner of wonderful things, material, spiritual, governmental, and otherwise. And so as we give thanks on Thanksgiving, I do think it pays to recall, there's something much more fundamental than the food on the table or the football games on TV, even though I will enjoy all of those things, as I'm sure all of you will and all of our listeners and viewers will. But this is really about giving thanks to God for the ability to establish this country, which is really a light unto all nations and a nation that has been incredibly blessed heretofore. So on that note, on behalf of Will, Inez, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. Happy Thanksgiving. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.